Reading closely is one of the most important skills you can work on during college. The expression reading closely, though, seems a lot more straightforward than it is. When a teacher asks you to read closely, she or he is usually asking you to do more than merely slow down and take the time necessary to digest whatever you're reading, though these are probably important parts of the task at hand. Reading closely also involves preparing yourself to take something away from what you've read. The most obvious way to demonstrate that you've gained something from reading is to show what you've learned by verbalizing it. Equally important, though, is the mental work of arranging key ideas that you pull from your reading in a way that can help you remember and recall them in the future. Your ability to remember, recall, and verbalize what you've read demonstrates that you have read closely and shows that you have learned something that you can travel with, an important stepping stone to independent thinking. In talking today about ways to mark up a text, my goal is to help you develop skills in what we might call meta-processing. By this I mean that I want to help you reflect on what you're processing as you read, and also cultivate skills in visually signaling what you'd like to take away from your reading so that you can better communicate what you've learned to others, review for exams, and commit key points to memory for use on some other occasion. Many of you have probably learned in high school how to outline a thesis or the key ideas in a given text. What I'll present today can be considered a pre-outline exercise, insofar as it helps you to trace the flow of an author's argument and determine which points are most important. Prioritize ideas that you think are important over others. Cluster these ideas into sets. Contribute your own ideas to the authors and organize them effectively in the margins of the text you're reading. And produce what is effectively a crib sheet for future study. In these respects, the techniques I'll outline can either substitute for an outline or, if you really want to commit key points from your reading to recall and later use, provide you with ready-made preparatory notes for pulling together an excellent outline very quickly. For this lesson, I've chosen a chapter from the book, How to Do Things with Words, by the well-known British language philosopher John Austin. The first and most important thing you need to do when coming to a text like this, with any hope of understanding or making use of its key contributions, is to have a pencil in your hand. Get in the habit. A single well-sharpened or mechanical pencil is going to be far more effective for you than a colored marker. How many times have you come across used textbooks that have entire paragraphs or even pages brilliantly splashed with highlighter ink? I come across this kind of thing and wonder, what did the reader really take away from this book? Don't dread the lead. All right, so here are 10 ways to mark your text. Number 1, a simple line. Rather than having to trace each and every sentence with your highlighter, just draw a clean line in the margin. It's quick and very clear. Here's what's important on this page. Number 2, a circled word or phrase. Okay. A circle highlights the key idea in a given paragraph, or even an entire section. It provides you with a quick gloss on a whole lot more. What is this all about? In this case, it's about statements. It's important to note, this key word or phrase may cue you to the author's own main point, but it might also be the key thing you want to take away, and that the author might actually have another vocabulary for. In the sentence I've selected here, the word statements is not necessarily prioritized by John Austin as the most important idea. In light of what he says, though, in the following sentences, as well as the next few pages, I felt that this word best summarizes what he's discussing. So after reading those pages, I went back and circled this word. Marking up a text then involves some brief recycling as you move back in light of what you were reading to earlier ideas in order to highlight them as one might on the top Roman numeral of an outline. This need not be a time-consuming process. In fact, when you get in the habit of doing this kind of very brief reviewing and marking up, you'll be saving yourself a lot of time down the road as you try to recall what you're learning and perhaps verbalize it to someone else, like your teacher in class. Number 3, outline numbers and letters in margins. Another very important method. So this signals key points in the text you're reading. The advantage of numbers and/or letters over circling is, of course, sequencing. You're signaling to yourself to order a series of interconnected points. Written in the margins, the number or letter should be placed on roughly the same horizontal plane as the main idea as much as possible. So here, for example, my number 1 is written where the word first in the phrase "first came the view" is written, and my number 2 where the word second occurs in Austin's clause as a second stage. Numbering is especially helpful where authors introduce a sequence of ideas or points in an argument without necessarily signposting them. Here the words first and second occur, so that's helpful, but in many cases you aren't provided with such clear signaling. The letters A, B, and C here are an example of the way your own notes can help outline the author's separate subpoints for easy visual access and later recall. Number 4, underlined words. This marking technique is similar to circling, but gives the selected word slightly less emphasis. I often use underlined words in combination with outline numbers and letters to help me focus quickly on the single most important idea in a given subsection. I should say here that, as you can see so far, the way I've marked up this text allows me to scan what is a language philosopher's very dense prose and quickly pull out the key components of his exposition. On this page, Austin is talking about statements, circled. Both those that are verifiable, underlined, number 1, and those that are considered pseudo-statements, number 2, also underlined. Pseudo-statements that are not straightforward, also underlined. So notice that I'm using the underlining here to create my own message to myself. Pseudo-statements, not straightforward, out of the author's own paragraph, summarizing his argument, but doing so in my own way. I'm kind of text messaging myself in the way you might do on a smartphone. Number 5, double line at margin. All right, so I use this technique all the time and find it one of the most effective ways to really hone in on a larger chunk of text that I find important in whatever I'm reading. Sometimes the double underline is just an inch long. Sometimes the underline runs 2, 3, or even 4 inches long if I'm finding each and every word crucial for pulling out the significance of what the author is saying. For really, really important sentences, I'll occasionally use a triple underline. I might do this once or twice in an entire book, and in those cases I'd usually be writing the idea down somewhere else too, with a bibliographic note to where I found that idea. Generally though, when used with the other marking techniques, I've found the 2 lines sufficient. Number 6, notes in margins. This is one of the most age-old and familiar marking techniques for readers who like to append their own thoughts as, literally, marginalia to a given author's own work. I often write things in the margins, and while they can be mere verbal reiterations of what the author is saying, in which case I use my own simplified language to summarize and gloss, I also often add my own new thoughts in the margins. Writing in the margins then becomes a way for you to provide your own ongoing commentary on what's being presented, and in that way makes the text work for you in whatever way you see fit. Number 7, footnoting. For you avid note takers, footnoting is as useful when you run out of space on the side margins. I typically do this by placing an asterisk at a convenient stopping point and then extending my notes at the bottom of the page. If I have multiple footnotes, which doesn't often happen, I use other creative symbols or occasionally numbers. Some of you might be familiar with the scenario of tiny words jammed into the margins, wrapping around the corners of a page, climbing up sideways to the top, and then flipping upside down. I mean, I've occasionally ended up in that kind of scenario. I'm not sure I've ever reached a full 360. Usually at that point, I will get out some other piece of paper and have the good sense to stop writing. Number 8, keywords at the upper corner. This is a really effective technique for later recall purposes. For example, when you're studying for an exam and want to go back to a longer book and find where it was that the author discussed the idea of constatives or pseudo-statements. What you do is write just one word or phrase in the top corner of the page, could be on the left or the right. Then, when you want to find it, you can scan back quickly through the text. If you're searching through a larger book, this technique is especially key. You can use your thumb to flip through loads of pages really fast, waiting for that flash of a word that might cue you to just the right passage you're looking for. Number 9, supplementary brackets. These are brackets that indicate material not considered all that important to the key ideas of the text you're reading, but that might still be helpful when you're trying to hone in quickly on particular aspects of the author's larger points. I don't use these brackets all that often, but they do prove useful on occasion. In this case, I've bracketed examples that the author gives to illustrate his thesis and that I might find helpful when later trying to communicate his ideas to others. Number 10, cueing arrows, down or up, or both up and down. This technique I use all the time. It's very helpful for signaling to myself how an author is developing an argument, especially when it has a whole lot of different branches and I get confused about what the author is trying to convey at a particular juncture. A down arrow signals the most important sentence for introducing what follows. Oftentimes, this sentence leads off the paragraph. In many cases, though, key sentences are embedded within given paragraphs and aren't obvious when looking at a page and trying to assess its contribution to the author's thesis. A down arrow tells me where to focus for a quick introduction to what follows. An up arrow shows me where to look for a quick review of what an author has already said. If the material reviewed is located in the immediate paragraph above, I use a small arrow. If the material reviewed extends over the course of several pages, I'll use a bigger arrow. Sometimes then I can have multiple and embedded arrows, some indicating major aspects of the thesis and some indicating minor ones. Finally, arrows pointing both up and down direct my eye to key sentences that summarize points made above and also below this area. These arrows are helpful in the midst of a lot of challenging material when all of a sudden a diamond in the rough suddenly emerges and clarifies the text for you in ways that can help you understand and recall the gist of an author's thesis without a whole lot of trouble. Those then are 10 ways to mark a text that I have found to be very helpful. Feel free to use them as you see fit, and perhaps also to come up with techniques of your own that complement these and enrich your own individual reading practices. So, everybody grab your pencils and start marking.